Hi, everyone. This is Tony, the host of Their Radio. Today, I have a guest, a very special guest. Today, we have the author of Mothership Connected, the son of Mallia Franklin, and the person dubbed as the Diva Whisperer by none other than Shaka Khan. Is that correct? Shaka Khan?
True.
Shaka
Yes.
Khan. Seth Neblett. Seth Neblett, thank you for joining us here at Their Radio. How you been?
No problem. Glad to be here.
Yeah, I thought it was hella cool that Shaka Khan dubbed you the Diva Whisperer. But could you
Yeah.
tell us a little bit about why she gave you that nickname?
Well, my mother kind of being a diva, being a member of Parliament-Funkadelic, known as Queen of Funk in the music industry, started with her. But since her, especially since I moved out here to LA, I've been working with a lot of women. I manage a version of the Mary Jane Girls, original Mary Jane Girls, Maxie and Sherry. I manage Bernadette Cooper's Climax. I do a podcast with Apollonia Cotero from Purple Rain, Apollonia Studio 6. I've directed music videos and shot photos of Shaka Khan. She calls me the Diva Whisperer because she says I understand the temperament. I understand, dealing with that particular kind of woman. I won't say necessarily a diva, but a woman in the industry, in the music industry, and women with that background because my mother was that woman, so I was reared up in that background.
Yeah, most definitely. So we're gonna touch into that a little bit more about that, which is the book Mothership Connected. But before we get into the book, and we are talking about women in your life, I
Mhm.
want to start off with this question. Um, Before even funk, I want to talk about your grandmother because
Okay.
that's also a place where you start off in the book. But even, even I've seen your interviews within the last weeks.
Mhm.
Your grandmother plays such a big role in a lot of these interviews. So I
Mhm.
want to ask you, who is your grandmother and what is her impact in the city of Detroit?
Okay. My grandmother was a woman named Sarah Christine Franklin. In the 40s, she was one of the first union organizers, female, in history in her 20s, 23, 24, 25. In the 40s, she was organizing restaurant workers union, insurance workers unions, things like that. And actually, the way that she met my grandfather, my mother's father, my grandfather was a foundry leader at Ford Motor Company, and my grandmother went in with the union, with the UAW, to unionize the auto workers. And what was interesting about my grandmother's story was my grandmother was a Caucasian woman. My grandfather was black and Cuban mix uh, in the late 40s in Detroit during a time when mixed race marriages was not really popular. It definitely wasn't popular for a woman, a white woman that was considered a woman of power. And so my mother was reared up in, kind of that civil rights, uh, fighting for equality, uh, type of household with having a black father and having a white mother that was very progressive in fighting for the rights of minorities, fighting for the rights of women. Yeah, she was very impactful in the union scene.
Yeah. I know towards the beginning of the book, there's this one section where you talk about your family having a red file throughout
Hmm.
the 60s and the 70s and how your mother learned about that in 92. This was like way after all of this that was happening. How was that learning about that and learning that, your family had that like a red file by the US government?
Yeah, interestingly enough, I was the one who drove my grandmother down to the federal building in 92 to pick up her red file. She had been contacted by the FBI in 1992, and they let her know that they had a red file from the 50s and 60s on her, and they actually had one on my grandfather too. And they were releasing it, and she could come and pick it up. And so I drove her down there, and once we got the red file, we saw all sorts of surveillance notes on my grandmother and grandfather, on my mother and her sister. We saw things dating back to the 40s. Um, all sorts of things, newspaper clippings on my grandmother back then. She was a member of what was called the Progressive Party. That was something that was founded by the vice president at the time, Vice President Wallace, under Franklin Delano Roosevelt. I think it was either Roosevelt or Eisenhower. I can't think of right now, but and so yeah, they finally released it to her in the 90s, and I took her down the federal building to pick it up. It was very eye-opening.
Yeah, yeah. And I think it was important for me to ask these because this kind of sets the way I was reading it. It also kind of set the foundation as to what your mother's approach, even within the music and like advocating for her rights, for women's rights, and also like going a little bit more about. I wanted to ask you a little bit more about the creation of the book. So this is the foundation that your mother was set, but for you, how did this history impact your creation on creating this book on the women of Parliament-Funkadelic?
Well, I think for me, it was important to do this book because um, personally, uh, my mother really spent most of my childhood uh, chasing her career, trying to fulfill her career. And I am one of many children that probably were in that kind of situation where the parents, were juggling between trying to find their fame in the entertainment industry, but also trying to be parents. And for me, it was important for my mother's story and these women of Parliament-Funkadelic story to get out because, in a way, our relationship was sacrificed in a bit of a way. So for me, if nobody knows her story and nobody knows what she did, the great things she did do in the music industry, then for me, it made me feel like the sacrifice was for nothing. So a little bit of myself, outside of just wanting people to know this story of these women, it was also a little personal for me because, if people didn't know what my mother had done and these other women had done, but specifically my mother, then it was like, well, was all of that for? And I knew that if I didn't do it, probably nobody would do it.
Yeah, yeah. And I want to take it back a little bit to this moment, at the genesis and the origin of this book, and the role that Los Angeles plays. So I
Hmm.
know that Los Angeles plays a role in the creation of this book, and you're mentioning you took the lead in the role of really putting the story out. And you've mentioned before how like you were actually looking for someone else to write the story, and that nobody really understood it the way you did. But could you tell us about what was happening in 2006 and what led to you writing this book and the start of that?
Okay. Well, when this book was first kind of thought of or became an idea to write a book, I was not a person that was seeking to be the writer. And myself and my mother and some of the other women that were involved, originally, we, looked at different writers. They talked to a few different writers, and it really was not gelling the way that it was supposed to. And at the time, I was living in Detroit because I'm originally from Detroit, Michigan. And so uh, what happened was I moved out here in 2006 to be closer to my mother and my father, who both lived out here separately, but they were both in the music industry. My mother, of course, with her affiliation with Parliament-Funkadelic, and at that time, more than Parliament-Funkadelic, also a lot of the death row, like Snoop Dogg and Dr. Dre, and she did a lot of work with them. And then my father, being a drummer, a very well-respected session drummer and live drummer who played drums for Aretha Franklin for like 30 years and also played with like the Pointer Sisters and the Supremes and all sorts different sorts of acts. I decided to come out here. And when I came out here, one of the first people that uh, I had came in contact with Bootsy was Bootsy Collins, who is my godfather. And me and my mother were having dinner with Bootsy, and I was kind of bitching about the fact that I didn't, we were trying to find a writer, and we really couldn't find a writer that everybody liked. And Bootsy basically said, "You do it." And I was resistant at first because I had never written anything. And, he assured me, he said, you're smart, you know all the players, you have a personal relationship with all the people, so they'll be tend to be more honest with you. And you know when somebody is bullshitting you because you know the story, you know how this goes. And after that conversation, I started really going full force with writing this book and doing interviews, doing all the interviews with this book and getting it written. So that's how it all happened.
Yeah, and I remember you mentioning also that there was like conversations of a reunion tour with the
Mhm.
Parlettes and the Brides of Funkenstein.
Yeah.
Was that kind of also connected with making this story also, being brought to life? That reunion tour?
That actually happened first. That was a concept that I was trying to bring together in the mid 90s. And what brought that on was once hip hop really, started taking off, um, the various record companies that Parlet and the Brides and Parliament and Funkadelic were all signed to started doing all the reissues of the old vinyls on CD. And so when those kind of greatest hits compilations and all those things came out, there was one particular that came out in 1994. Mercury Records and Casablanca Records had reissued the Best of Parlet featuring Parliament. And that was really kind of the spark to where, I started talking to my mother and saying, well, what do you think about a Parlet reunion? And she was game for it. We thought that we could make something happen. So I found the other Parlettes that she probably hadn't spoken to in at least 15 years. And then maybe about a year after that, I contacted Dawn Silva of the Brides of Funkenstein, and we contacted Lynn Mabry, who was also the original bride. But by that time, Lynn was like, touring with Sheila E. and Bette Midler, and she was very connected and successful in what she was doing. So, we had actually contacted another woman who was a bride, a woman by the name of Sheila Horn, and we were really trying to put together this Parlet Brides reunion. And we had a couple of false starts. Like we did one show in Detroit that was the launch show that I put together. And then there was another show in New York, but it never really took off. And a lot of it had to do with the fact of kind of some of the residue of the things that are talked about in Mothership Reconnected. I mean, Mothership Connected is that, there in some ways there was a poisoning kind of these women against each other. And unfortunately, that is generational through many ethnic groups, is that women are kind of pit against each other by men, and they have a tendency to compete with each other. And that was something that was definitely going on in the 70s with the Parliament-Funkadelic thing. The Part P Funk organization did have a hand in kind of pitting the brides against Parlet, and it really wasn't too successful for either one of them, really. But unfortunately, when we got to the 90s, and here I am, 20 some years old, trying to, make something happen. And then, those old demons just were rearing their heads. So it just never happened. But what it did do was it started conversations about these women reconnecting, which ultimately, became a core group of women that were the foundation of this book, Mothership Connected.
Yeah, and could you let us know who the foundation of this book is? Who are those women who drive the story and the narrative within the book?
Yeah. The five women that are featured, now, mind you, these are not the only women that have been parlettes and brides, but the five women that uh, uh, push this book forward are my mother, Mallia Franklin, who was an original member of Parlet, Debbie Wright, who was another original member of Parlet. My mother and Debbie were two of the first women to sing with Parliament-Funkadelic. um, Shirley Hayden, who actually replaced Debbie Wright, but she was a Parlet, came in very early, like maybe 2 months after the first Parlet album came out. And then you have Lynn Mabry and Dawn Silver, who were the original brides of Funkenstein. So those are the five women that are driving this story forward.
Yeah, I want to trace it back a little to what you just mentioned as well about how like this group is from the 70s, but then we're also trying to make this reunion happen in the 90s, and a lot of that residue kind of was still lingering there.
Mhm.
A lot of the times we think that the women then at that time were grown, but they were young, they were girls for the most part, right? A lot of times teens.
Yep.
And now when we have these conversations, now that they're older, from your experience, how was that reflection for many of them looking back in those at those moments, and were they able to rekindle that friendship or those moments with each other?
I think that there were some friendships that, lasted continued to last even after those years. And you're right, they were very young when all of this was going on. I mean, I want to say that Lynn Mabry may have been 20, so we're talking about women that were 20 to maybe 27 when they were at the height of everything that was going on. So when you got around to the 90s, when they're in their 40s and things like that, um, some things had changed. Many things hadn't changed, unfortunately. But, there were definite relationships that had uh, transcended from the P-Funk years into further years on. Yeah, definitely.
Most definitely. The 90s,
Mhm.
West Coast hip hop, G Funk, P Funk, the influence is undeniable. It's direct. So I want to ask you before I go into deeper questions about this. Um, at one time, P Funk had their headquarters here in Los Angeles on Hollywood and Vine.
Yep.
Right. And it was also held together by a woman. It was held
Hmm.
together by Brenda Pierce Adams.
Yes.
Um, why do you think funk was so influential to the West Coast?
I think that, funk is the undeniable foundation just of the groove. And I think that James Brown and Parliament-Funkadelic had the foundation and the groove that uh, rappers and hip hop artists, specifically West Coast, could uh, uh, pull and sample and do their thing on the top of. The other reason why I think that it was important is you have to kind of understand that this is the music that their mother and father listened to. This is the music that their aunts and uncles listened to. This is the music that they played at the parties and in the basements and at the barbecues. And, so there was a familiarity by these rappers, especially these West Coast rappers, because they had grown up listening to this music.
Most definitely. And the headquarters were here. Your mom,
Hmm.
you mentioned your mom was living here as well.
Yep.
So there was a hub going on for sure at the
Hmm.
time, right? And talking a little bit more about that connection between West Coast and specifically your mother. I saw this photo of, that Bootsy posted a few years ago with your mom, Mallia Franklin,
Hmm.
and Shock G from Digital
Yeah.
Underground. I don't know if you've seen that photo.
Yep.
Do you
I've
do
seen
you
that.
know what was happening in that photo? What was going on? What's the background behind that?
I don't know specifically that particular photo because I wasn't living here yet. But I do know that when my mother came out here again, because she lived out here in LA three different times that I can remember. In the early 70s, she was out here, and then she came back in the early 90s, 91 or 92. That's when she started doing work with Dr. Dre and Snoop Dogg and Suge Knight, and she was doing a lot of stuff for Death Row. And one of the things that she did for Death Row was that because they were using so many of the Parliament-Funkadelic choruses on a lot of that West Coast G-Funk rap, uh, they actually uh, hired my mother to sing on a lot of that stuff, to train the other singers at Death Row on how to have the flavor and the sound of Parliament Funkadelic and Parlet and the Brides. My mother did a lot of work with rappers like RBX. She did a lot of work with Snoop Dogg. She's on Doggy Style, the very first album. Probably most prominently, she did one of the interludes in it that was called W Balls. That was basically the end or the one of the lines in Flashlight from by Parliament. And then she also wrote a song with him called Suited and Booted. She did something that they used in Undercover Brother. So, she was deep into that. And then eventually, in 1994, while she was, still working with Death Row, she introduced Dr. Dre to Roger Troutman of Zapp, and that birthed the Tupac song "California Love."
Yeah. Do you know where that relationship started from between Roger Troutman and your mom, Mallia Franklin?
Roger and Zapp were originally supposed to be part of the Parliament Funkadelic organization, and my mother. Uh, on Zap 2's album was a very, very big part of the recording on that. She did songs like Do Why Diddy, she did songs like Dance Floor, and then she also did a song that is very, I just rediscovered actually from doing a lot of the old school shows with Mary Jane Girls. My mother is the co-lead on a song that's very popular, especially in the Latino community, by Zach called "Do You Really Want an Answer?" And so she, was had been friends with Roger Troutman since 1980, and when Dr. Dre was interested in working with him, he had reservations because Roger was always very clean cut. He didn't do drugs, he didn't deal with any of that kind of stuff. And at the time, Dr. Dre was in the midst of the chronic. And so he told my mother one night, my mother was at his house in Calabasas, and he said, I really want to do something with Roger Troutman. And what's your advice? How can I do it? And she gave him the advice that he needed to hear. And then she picked up the phone and called Roger and got Roger on the phone and handed the phone to Dr. Dre. And the next thing we knew, Roger was out here and they were doing California Love for Tupac.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Because even thinking about, like you mentioned, Snoop Dogg, and like
Mhm.
one of them, like one of like the most known things, even when I think of my childhood, is like Snoop Doggy,
Hmm.
which is right. It's just the Atomic Dog reference,
That's all it
and
is.
the yeah, right.
Yeah.
And your mother played a big role in also creating Atomic Dog. Could you tell us a
Mhm.
little bit more about that? I always love to hear this story.
Yeah, my mom, well, she did a few things when it came to Atomic Dog. One of the things that she did is one of the musicians that uh, not necessarily came in through her, but kind of was solidified through her, was a gentleman by the name of David Lee Spradley in probably around 1980. David Lee Spradley is the guy that created the music for Atomic Dog. He's the one that turned the tape over and started playing the tape in reverse and all of that. All of that is the brainchild of David Lee Spradley. Now, probably what my mother did outside of singing on Atomic Dog, the thing that she did that she probably should be a millionaire for doing is that in the beginning of the song, when you hear everybody panting like a dog, when George starts rapping and you hear that, that was all my mother's brainchild. She came up with that in the studio. And I often say, if she got royalties for every time an artist just sampled that little piece of Atomic Dog and used it in a track, she would have been a millionaire.
Yeah. Not only your mother, but I've heard you also mention that like none of the women in Parliament and Funkadelic received any royalties. Is that correct?
Lynn Mabry of the Brides of Funkenstein said she'd never received any royalties. The only royalties that I've ever been able to uncover for as far as my mother and her Parlette days were very, very scarce. She didn't get any royalties for her work with Parliament Funkadelic at all. She got a little bit of royalties when it came to Parlette because technically her contract with George Clinton was as the leader of Parlette. So she did get some Parlette royalties, but she sang on all the Parliament Funkadelic stuff. She sang on One Nation Under Groove. She sang on Flashlight. She sang on Not Just Knee Deep. She sang on We Want the Funk. She sang on all of that, but didn't get any royalties for any of it. I just started getting some royalties for her through Sound Exchange, through some of the, digital replays.
Oh wow. Um, this is the last question I have regarding the West Coast, and then I will move forward with the questions. But
Okay.
one last thing, and this you mentioned at the book reading where I was present at, but you mentioned the story about Ice Cube and
Mhm.
your mom. And at one point, there could have been a record deal that happened between your mom and Sylvia Rhone and Ice Cube. Could you tell us a little bit more about that story?
Yeah, in 1992, if I'm not mistaken, one of the interviews that I did for this book was because if most people, will discover that get this book, that this book is really an oral history. This book is the actual people telling the story. I'm giving them who, what, when, and where, and I'm kind of crafting it and putting it together, but it's the actual people, the actual women and the men that were involved telling the story. And one of the stories that I discovered very, very late on about my mother was when I was interviewing a guy by the name of Bruce Peterson, who started off as a manager for Parliament Funkadelic in the 70s, but by 90 or 91, he was managing my mother. And when my mother moved back here to LA, Bruce actually came back with her. And Bruce was from the LA area. And I believe he had some ties in with some of the LA rappers. So he really could open the door for her to get in good with Death Row and get in good with Suge Knight and Dr. Dre and Ice Cube and people like that. Well, anyway, this particular day in 92, my mother and Bruce, according to Bruce, my mother and Bruce were over at Ice Cube's offices, and Bootsy was coming into town. And Ice Cube at that time had never met Bootsy. So my mother and Bruce got in touch with Bootsy and told Bootsy, hey, come on down to Ice Cube's office. He'd love to meet you. And Bootsy came down. And according to Bruce, Ice Cube started telling a story about how he had never seen Parliament Funkadelic live and that his mother had actually gone to a P-Funk concert and told him how great it was and that he felt slighted. He felt like, oh my God, she talked about how great this concert was. And at the time, Ice Cube was making good money. And he said, well, you know, maybe I should try to do a reunion tour of Parliament Funkadelic. And we're talking about 92. So the original group hadn't been together for probably about 12 years. So he wanted to do the whole thing. He wanted to bring in Bootsy. He wanted to revamp, join the Brides, rejoin Parlette, and, do it like it was done in the 70s. His only caveat was that he wanted to be on the show. So Bruce Peterson, who had worked for George and still had good relationships with George Clinton, told Ice Cube, well, I can help you do this, but I need something in return. I need you to get Mallia a record deal. And Ice Cube on the spot, his manager was at the office that day, a woman by the name of Pat Charbonnet. And Pat Charbonnet and Sylvia Rhone were best friends at the time. So Pat Charbonnet got Sylvia Rhone on the phone, and Ice Cube basically told her, that I would like for you to give Mallia Franklin, one of the Parlettes, a record deal. And, I think one of the things that interested Sylvia at the time was that they knew that they could get, Ice Cube was going to produce some things. They knew that they could get Dr. Dre to produce some things. George Clinton was willing to produce some things. Bootsy Collins was willing to produce something. And my mother already had a relationship with Prince. And Prince had made a promise to her that, if she got a record deal, that he would contribute to the record. So, it could have been a huge, huge record because you have all these heavy hitters that were really willing to do it because of the things my mother had done in the past for them and for the record industry as a whole. So what ended up happening was Sylvia Rhone wanted them to fly to New York the next day from LA, my mother and her manager, and I want to say that Bootsy was supposed to go too. And my mother refused the deal. And she refused the deal basically on the premise that she didn't want to work for a woman. And which was sad because she didn't know Sylvia Rhone. She had never met Sylvia Rhone. She didn't know anything about Sylvia Rhone. But those scars of competition and all those things were so deep within her that she was willing to forego something that could have changed her life, actually, because of just those ghosts from the past of not being able to trust women. So unfortunately, she didn't do it. It never happened. When Bruce Peterson told me that story, I was literally shocked because I had never heard it. And I mean, by this time, my mother had been gone. She'd passed away maybe 9 years before. So I think Bruce might have told me this in 2019, 2018. I looked at him like he was crazy. I had never heard that in my life.
And even when we mentioned earlier, when we were having this conversation, you were talking about the residue that kind of still lingered from the 70s and
Mhm.
how a lot of this conflict was also man made, literally by men, right? Creating this conflict. And, you started the book. I saw this phrase in the beginning of the book, and I want to read this to you because I feel like this kind of also summarizes the book in a way. But you talk about that you describe the Parliament-Funkadelic time as kind of masquerade as unequivocally progressive. In the book, I feel like it kind of like breaks down that phrase and kind of unmasks that.
Mhm.
So at the book reading, also something that I remember was that Lynn Mabry mentioned how you provided safety for them to share these stories.
Yeah.
Um, what does safety look like for you when you were documenting and sharing these stories?
I think that safety for them with me was the fact that many of these stories were not foreign to me. Many of these stories were not necessarily new. I may not have known all the nuances, but as a child who, was in the environment, there were a lot of things that I saw firsthand. So I think because these women and just everybody in general had known me since I was a little boy and knew that I had come up in it, they were probably felt safer about talking about maybe the more taboo tidbits of the story and giving me more than they probably would have given, let's say, if a writer had been commissioned to write this book. Um, I think because I knew the questions to ask, because I had basic knowledge of a lot of it, it made it easier. And just the comfort level. It was like they were talking to a member of their family. They were talking to a nephew. They were talking to somebody that they watched grow up. So it wasn't like they were talking to a stranger. They were talking to a family member.
For you, why was it important for you to say it's an oral history? The book is oral history, instead of saying like it's a biography of the moment or of the time. But yeah, why was it important for you to say that or to mention that or make sure that it's known that it is an oral history?
Because it's not about me as the writer. It's not about me saying, this is how it was, this is the truth, this is the gospel according to Seth. It was not about me. It was about the women and the people that were a part of it telling the story. Because I don't know everybody's story, And so I, I think that it's more potent when the quotes are actually coming out of the person's mouth, not just saying, as the writer, such and such told me this, or this person told me this, or this person told me that, but actually putting their actual quotes in the story, I think makes it more powerful, especially when you're dealing with so many people.
Yeah, most definitely. At least 20 people in the book, right? And you can tell by the formatting of it, it's you know who the speaker is. It's separated by speakers. And if anything, you're just kind of bridging those quotes together, right?
Yeah.
So that's something that's very important that I think it's important to mention here in this interview, how the book is formatted. So definitely check out the book, definitely buy it. And towards the end of the episode, we'll let y'all know how you can get it. But we're mentioning in the previous conversation how the misogyny is still like right there and it's prevalent and you're able to see it even linger. Another thing I wanted to connect and talk a little bit more about that you mentioned in the book is that early on in the book, I was reading and you were sharing how at one point Sly saw Mallia Franklin sing, and
Hmm.
she said, and he told her like you should be a rock singer
Hmm.
because your look allows you to be a rock singer. And then
Hmm.
later on, you also talk about how the Parlettes they were kind of a fusion between disco and funk, and
Hmm.
how Neil Bogart wanted the group to be a crossover group, right?
Yeah.
So there's
Hmm.
always these moments where like we see these racist, misogynist system influencing the approach on music.
Hmm.
Um, does this moment in time remind you of any time within the Parliament-Funkadelic era?
You mean this moment right here in time? Um, it's so different now, because many artists have more control of their careers. Social media has changed everything, whereas really in the 70s, you were beholden to a record company for your success, and you could not reach your fan base directly. Really, the only thing you could do is go and do radio station interviews, do interviews for music magazines, and tour. That was really the extent of it. You couldn't do the things like we're doing right now. And then back then, everything had to be done through the organization. So it wasn't like somebody would just call one of the girls and say, "Hey, we want you to be on such and so." It all had to go through the machine. And when you are under that kind of control, they are the ones that really, can dictate your fame. With my mother in particular, and Neil Bogart wanting to cross Parlet over and things like that, a lot of that had to do with the fact that at that time in 1978, a white appearing woman, I'm not going to say a white woman because she wasn't a white woman, she was mixed, was considered a quadroon, which was the fourth black, but a Caucasian appearing woman that had the voice of a black woman was not typical. This was before Tina Marie, this was before Mariah Carey, this was before that was going on. So I think what Neil Bogart saw in my mother specific was she has the look that can cross Parlet over into a mainstream market that, may have been a little friendlier to the leader having a very Caucasian look, or a very non descript look, like you didn't know what she was. Is she white? Is she Latin? Is she, what is she? You know, but he, at that time especially, knew that that was a ticket. That could have been a ticket to cross Parlet over. So, that was really his thought. He really was very interested in my mother being a solo artist for Casablanca after her tenure with Parlet was over. That's really what he wanted, because that's kind of where he saw the dollar signs. Was, here you go, you have this white woman, this white looking woman that sings very black, and that was not the norm back then.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's this Parliament-Funkadelic, they're known as like, really pushing the musical boundaries forward. But then
Mhm.
we also learned through this book that there was a lot of these things that were also not as progressive as they seem to be, right?
Mhm.
So I kind of want to ask you, also looking a little bit more broad, um, based on the story shared, like what are some things that you think we should take from the Parliament and Funkadelic movement, and what are some things that you think we should leave behind, those kind of things?
I think the most important thing to say is that Parliament-Funkadelic was one of the most important musical organizations ever. I think that Parliament-Funkadelic created a catalog of music and a sound that transcended way from the 70s, and you can still hear today. People still sampling Parliament-Funkadelic songs today, or using a Parliament-Funkadelic phrasing in their vocal or anything like that. I also want to convey that the women of Parliament-Funkadelic, the Parlettes and the Brides of Funkenstein, were just as important to what female groups became after them. They were they were definitely there was definite influence from black female groups like the Supremes and like LaBelle, but because Parliament-Funkadelic was so ahead of its time, they were able to create a blueprint that launched the Vanity Sixes and the Mary Jane Girls and the In Vogues and the TLCs. And one of the things, speaking of TLC, that most people don't know, but probably will know after this book, is if you I don't know if anybody's ever seen the little TLC made for TV movie that with Little Mama. But one of the things that they talk about in the script is when they were doing their last album, Fan Mail, was that Lisa Left Eye Lopez told them that this needs to be the female Parliament Funkadelic album. And if you look at the video for No Scrubs, No Scrubs is a direct tribute to Parlet's pleasure principle, even down to the rap section of the video when Left Eye is doing the rap, and she has this silver helmet on her head that is the exact same helmet as Parlet wore on Pleasure Principle in 1978. And so, there are those connections that are, most people don't know where it came from, or they think that it was brand new, but it really was influenced by these women. And, artists like Left Eye and artists that were in the music business, they were aware of these influences, and, they went with them. There's a video by Invo called Whatever, where they're basically these brides of Funkenstein in this lab being created by this man. So, I mean, you see all of these different things, even down to a episode of American Dad. For anybody that watches American Dad, there is a there is an episode that talks about Hershey Park, this whole stuff that happens at Hershey Park. And at the end of that episode, these three women come out and sing basically the line from Flashlight. And they go, everything happens at Hershey Park, Hershey Park, Hershey. Those are direct Parliament Funkadelic female references.
And there wouldn't be no Parliament Funkadelic without the women behind it, right? the main
Definitely.
reason the main reason Parliament Funkadelic became that was because of the connection with Bootsy and George, right? And the
Yeah, and
person
if it
behind
hadn't have been
that,
for Mallia, if it hadn't have been for Mallia Franklin, that would have never happened.
exactly, exactly. And I think it's so important to share that, to know that, especially now in a time where history is erased,
Yes.
history
Yes. Yes.
intentionally erased, and in now this book is bringing to light, which something that has always been there, will always be there, and
Mhm.
now more than ever, it deserves the light that it always should have got.
Thank
Um,
you. Thank you.
yeah. So yeah, I one last question, a few last questions actually. I
Yeah.
I actually help teach an oral history course to high school students.
Okay.
And so as a oral historian yourself, as who's wrote a book on it, transcribed. We're talking about transcribing today, transcribing these these interviews, and how, like, we got to make sure they flow, they're fluid, they're concise.
Yeah.
Um, what is some advice you would give our students for the class? On oral
Oh,
history, including recording, documenting, but also approach.
yeah.
Approach on oral history is super important. What advice would you give to our students?
Record everything. That was one thing that I did in this process is every interview that I have, whether it's in person on video, whether it's audio over the phone, whatever it is, record everything. Because when you're writing, when you're doing these kind of things, especially oral receipts, you got to have oral histories, you have to have receipts for everything. Because sometimes people will get amnesia and say, I never said that to you. Like, no, you did. And so record everything. I would say that, there will come times where when you're transcribing these things, you may do a little bit of editing where it flows better, but never change the context or never change the intention of the person's quote. Don't edit it to change the attention. You might have to edit it to make it flow better. Sometimes people tend to repeat themselves, things like that. So sometimes you may have to craft it in a way where it flows, but never change the intention.
Most
That would be my
definitely.
advice.
Most definitely. Thank you, Seth. Um, any last things that you think are important to for people to know, and to go get the book, before they go get the book, what are some things that you think are important to let people know?
I tried to write this book that if you have very limited to no knowledge on Parliament-Funkadelic, outside of maybe knowing who George Clinton is or maybe knowing who Bootsy Collins is, that you can read this book and come away with a new understanding and appreciation for the group, especially the women. So that would be the thing that I think is most important. One other thing that I do want to mention while we're talking is that I was involved. One of the people, as I said, that I do a podcast was cast with is Apollonia Cotero from Purple Rain. For all the people that know, Apollonia was the leading lady of Purple Rain with Prince. We just did a short that I think is extremely important. It's on YouTube. It's called Show Me Your Papers. And Apollonia is of Mexican descent, and uh, it's just maybe a 3 minute, 3 to 5 minute short. But I think people should watch it. I think people should share it. I think it's very important in the times that we're in right now. That's the whole reason why she and the writers and directors, Alex and Jeff Consiglio, decided to do it. And I was involved as far as some uh, um, ideas involving script and things like that. So show me your papers on YouTube. Check it out. I think it's very, very, very important for people to see. And Mothership Connected, buy it. It's number one right now on Amazon R&B Soul books, and buy it.
Did it beat
Mothership Connected.
Beyonce?
It beat Beyonce the next day. The
Oh
next
wow.
day after the
Yeah.
yeah, the next day after the book event at Book Soup. I looked
Hmm.
on Amazon and it went from number two to number one, and it's been number one consistent ever since.
That's awesome. How could people find the book? Could they find you on social medias? What social media is the website?
Yeah. There's a couple of ways you can find the book. As I said, Amazon.com, you can get it. You can also get it from University of Texas Press, which is the publisher. And then my social media, my personal social media that is kind of encompassing on Instagram is Seth a Million. And then Mothership Connected has a dedicated Instagram at Mothership Connected. I have a TikTok, Seth Neblett, excuse me, on TikTok. And then on Facebook, Seth Neblett is my personal. And then Mothership Connected has an official Facebook page as well. And then also, you can go to mothershipconnected.com. The book itself does have a website. And one of the greatest things on the website is there is a store where you can buy t-shirts, you can buy posters like that one, you can buy autographed copies by myself of Mothership Connected. So yeah, mothershipconnected.com, and you'll see a link to the store.
Yeah, of course. And we'll definitely include that in the description of this episode. So
Great.
support Seth, support the book, but also, in the music, making sure we acknowledge women and people of different identities, because not only women, but people of different identities who play a large role in the music when we
Yeah.
think of house music, when we think of, even the origins of hip hop and the way
Mhm.
that women contributed to that.
Mhm.
So it's always important and intentional to highlight these stories. Thank you so much, Seth, for joining us. And I
Thank
know you're
you.
gonna head off on your book tour. So we
Yes.
wish you best of luck and
Thank you.
safety. And we're excited to see you come back in LA. And hopefully we catch you at the next event that you have on the
All
book.
right. I'm down.
Cool, cool.